I have been covering this case for weeks now. GPS data, federal divers, a thermal camera that went dark for 11 hours, a cadaver dog named Maggie, a dinghy seized by the Coast Guard, evidence that sources are describing as potentially devastating, and as of this week, federal investigators are officially treating the disappearance of Lynette Hooker as a possible foreign murder of a U.S. national. That is a formal federal homicide classification. It changes everything about how this case is being built. But that is not what changed how I looked at this investigation. A neighbor interview did. When Jordan Plentz's interview dropped, I almost moved past it. Another person saying they always knew something was wrong. Another character witness offering a bad feeling. We have heard that before. Then I read what she actually said. Jordan Plentz lived across the street from Brian and Lynette Hooker in Onstead, Michigan. She did not offer a feeling. She described a pattern, a specific, documented 25-year pattern of a woman trying to escape domestic violence, leaving periodically, staying in Michigan for months at a time, then going back. She said Lynette's own mother told her directly, "Brian is violent verbally and physically." And then she said something I keep coming back to. I anticipated she would leave before something this bad happened. The biggest question in the Lynette Hooker case may no longer be what happened in the water. It may be what was happening for 25 years before she ever got on that boat. A neighbor who was watching. A mother who told her what was happening inside. A security camera that may have captured something. A search that ended without Lynette but came back with evidence a law enforcement source described in 4 words. And an investigation that just committed the word murder to an official federal classification. Each of those things exists on its own. Together, they raise a question nobody was asking when this case started. She kept trying to leave. She just never made it far enough. This is not a search update. You have that in the previous video. This is the story underneath the investigation. The 25 years before the 4th of April. The neighbor who was watching from across the street. And what all of it looks like now that federal investigators are treating this as a homicide. Subscribe. Let's go through it. Lynette Hooker grew up in Michigan. Onstead, a small community in Lenawee County, the kind of place where your neighbor knows your mother and your mother knows your neighbor. She had a daughter, Carly. She had a mother, Darlene, who lived close enough that the woman across the street knew her by name and trusted her with the truth about what was happening inside the household. Friends described Lynette as warm, as someone whose presence registered when she walked into a room. Not performed, consistent. She built a life, worked, raised Carly. Maintained the kind of relationships where her mother could pick up the phone and tell a neighbor, "Watch out for my daughter when she comes home." In her 40s, she found sailing. Brian Hooker was experienced on the water. They built a life around it, documented it, shared it, gave it a name, the Sailing Hookers. 12 years of videos, anchorages, sunrises from a boat deck in waters most people only see in photographs. To anyone watching that channel, the life looked like the dream. Jordan Plentz lived across the street. She watched a different version. Darlene Hamlet is Lynette's mother. She is still in Michigan. She provided her DNA to federal investigators in May so that if divers find her daughter can be identified. She is still waiting for that to matter. The Sailing Hookers YouTube channel is still visible. Videos of the couple navigating offshore passages, exploring Caribbean anchorages, managing the soulmate through weather. Brian appears comfortable on camera, explaining systems, narrating navigation, sharing the technical side of live-aboard sailing. Lynette appears in the frame, present, smiling. Jordan Plentz watched those videos. Her assessment, it's more of a front, a facade of what really happens deep down. I think they try to make the best of it and tried to capture their memories, not necessarily directly their relationship. The gap between the documented version of a life and the actual version is not unusual. Social media rewards presentation. Most people show the version they want seen. What makes this gap significant is not the gap itself. It is what was on the other side of it, and who knew about it, and how long it had been there. Jordan Plentz knew for years, because Darlene told her. Jordan Plentz lived across the street from Brian and Lynette on their property in Onstead. When the couple came back from sailing, the off-season, the months on land, Jordan was there. She spoke to Jesse Weber on News Nation on the 4th of June. What she said deserves to be heard carefully, not summarized, not softened. She described Lynette's relationship with Brian as one that had always been rocky. She said Lynette would stay at the Michigan property for months at a time, away from Brian, away from what was happening on the boat. She has lived here on her own a couple of months, like out of the year, trying to get away from the domestic violence situation. She did not learn this from watching through a window. She learned it from Darlene. Lynette's mother would reach out to Jordan to let her know when Lynette was staying at the Michigan house. She wanted someone watching. Jordan's words, "She just told me, I just want to let you know when she'll be living there. Things are getting bad in the household. Brian is violent verbally and physically. You need to get away from that." A mother asking a neighbor to keep an eye on her daughter, because the daughter kept coming back. Jordan described the pattern. She would leave periodically and then always go back. It's a 25-year cycle, and it's not that easy for somebody to leave in that scenario. She paused before the next part. I anticipated she would leave before something this bad happened. She anticipated it. She was watching from across the street, and she thought Lynette would leave in time. Jordan Plentz has a home security camera, the Amazon Ring type, front yard and street coverage. Her camera has a sight line that includes the Hooker property. In September and October of 2025, before Brian and Lynette set sail for their final trip, they were at the Michigan house. Jordan's camera was recording. She confirmed to Jesse Weber that both the FBI and the Coast Guard have interviewed her. She is trying to regain access to the archived footage from those months. Her words, I was willing to give up my camera footage to them to see if they could catch any altercation, because they would walk late at night, but they were pretty private for the most part. She noted that Brian on camera, on YouTube, in public, was a different person than the private version Darlene described. The FBI has her name, the Coast Guard has her name. They have been to her house. Whatever that camera caught before they set sail is now part of what investigators are building. But Jordan's account describes something older than September, something that had been running for decades. Before we get into what a 25-year pattern looks like inside a relationship, and why federal investigators have now classified this as a homicide investigation, subscribe to Crime Deepcut. When the next development breaks, we will be here. 25 years, Jordan said it plainly. A 25-year cycle of leaving and returning, not a relationship that went bad after something specific happened, a relationship that had been this way for longer than most marriages last at all. That number is worth sitting with. If Lynette and Brian were together for 25 years, the cycle Jordan describes started early, not after a crisis, not after a turning point. It was the baseline. And the question Jordan raises, the one that stays after the interview ends, is not about Brian. It is about Lynette. What keeps someone in a cycle for 25 years? The honest answer is not a simple one. It is financial dependency. It is shared identity. It is the accumulated weight of 2.5 decades, a life too entangled to cleanly separate. It is hope that something will change. It is fear that leaving will make things worse before they get better. It is a 46-foot sailboat in the Caribbean that you helped build into a home. Jordan understood this. She said it directly. It's not that easy for somebody to leave in that scenario. Lynette did leave, repeatedly, for months at a time. She went back to Michigan. She stayed at the property. Darlene made sure Jordan was watching. And then she went back. Every time. Until April 4th, 2026. She kept trying to leave for 25 years. She just never made it far enough. The 25-year pattern has one documented moment in the official record. In 2015, Michigan police responded to a domestic altercation between Brian and Lynette Hooker. Both accused each other of assault. Lynette alleged that during the incident, Brian choked her. Officers noted a volatile dynamic. Alcohol was identified as a contributing factor. The investigation did not establish a clear primary aggressor. A warrant was denied. One incident. 11 years ago. On its own, it establishes nothing about what happened in the Bahamas. but it is the only incident that made it into the formal record in a 25-year cycle. Jordan described years of leaving and returning. Darlene described violence, verbal and physical, to a neighbor she trusted enough to ask to keep watch. Those are the years that do not have police reports. 2015 is the year one exists. Federal investigators now have Jordan's testimony. They have the 2015 incident. They have whatever September and October footage that camera across the street recorded. And they have a formal classification that says this is no longer a missing person case. It is a homicide investigation. Here's what Brian Hooker told investigators about the night of the 4th of April. He and Lynette left Hopetown in their 8-foot dinghy around 7:30 p.m. The water was rough. She bounced off the dinghy. His word. The engine key went with her. He was stranded. He paddled for hours. He arrived at Marsh Harbor around 4 a.m. That account, heard before the neighbor interview, sounded like a tragic accident. An experienced man on the water, overwhelmed by conditions, unable to save his wife. Heard after the neighbor interview, after the 25-year cycle, after Brian is violent verbally and physically, after I anticipated she would leave before something this bad happened. That same account sounds different. Not because any fact in it changed, because the context around it changed. A woman who had been trying to leave an abusive relationship for 25 years, who went back every time, who made it to the Bahamas, 12 years into a sailing life that had taken her further from Michigan than she had ever been. And a man whose own GPS device, the device he was wearing on the water that night, shows movements that do not match the account he gave investigators. Federal investigators are not treating Brian's account as the story of an accident. They are treating it as the story they need to disprove, and the classification they apply to this case tells you exactly how seriously they are taking that task. Before this chapter explains what the homicide classification means legally, it is worth seeing everything in one place. GPS data from Brian's phone shows the device stopped at locations in the Sea of Abaco he never mentioned to investigators. For 54 days, search teams looked in the wrong area because of his account. A thermal imaging camera aboard the Soulmate went dark for 11 hours on the night Lynette disappeared. The vessel's AI's tracking system, which broadcasts its position, was off for the same window. Photographs from Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of the 4th of April show calm, glassy water. Brian described a storm. The water where Brian says Lynette was swept away averages 3 to 5 feet deep. A person could stand in it. Brian made no calls to Lynette's family for 14 hours. He called Darlene only after a police press release made it unavoidable. A spare silent electric motor is missing from the Soulmate. Lynette's diving weight belt is missing from the Soulmate. The cadaver dog did not alert on the dinghy, meaning either no remains were transported in it, or contact duration was below the detection threshold. Witnesses near the Soulmate reported a loud splash around 9:30 p.m. and flares. Brian places those events in a different location and at a different time. Brian stayed aboard the Soulmate for approximately 24 hours after returning to it on the 5th of April, after Lynette had already been reported missing. Maybe none of these things individually proves what happened in the water on the night of the 4th of April. But when every new development points investigators back to the same person, when the GPS contradicts him, the timeline contradicts him, the photographs contradict him, the depth contradicts him, the phone records contradict him, and a neighbor across the street describes 25 years of violence ending with the words, "I anticipated she would leave before something this bad happened." That is when cases change direction. This one has. The U.S. government officially classified this case as a possible foreign murder of a U.S. national. That is not media shorthand. It is a formal legal designation with specific consequences. When that classification is applied, it activates federal murder statutes. The Coast Guard Investigative Service and the FBI receive concurrent jurisdiction to investigate a crime that did not occur on American soil. Investigators are no longer assisting the Royal Bahamas Police Force. They are leading an active homicide probe with the full authority of the U.S. federal government. Resources expand. Warrants become easier to obtain. The investigative posture shifts from reactive to deliberate. That classification did not come from a neighbor's interview. It came from weeks of evidence: GPS data, forensic analysis, the soulmate's inventory, the digital trail from Brian's devices. Whatever investigators found in that data was substantial enough to commit the word murder to an official federal classification. The neighbor described a 25-year cycle ending with a woman trying to escape. Federal investigators are describing a potential crime. These are two accounts of the same person reaching the same conclusion from different directions. The search ended the 5th of June without Lynette being found. What investigators brought back from those 3 days, and what sources are saying about it, is next. Subscribe to Crime Deepcut. On the 5th of June, the Coast Guard cutter departed the waters of the Abacos. 3 full days of searching, sonar, underwater drones, professional dive teams, Maggie the cadaver dog, everything. Lynette Hooker was not found. That headline, "No body," is accurate. It is not the full story of what those 3 days produced. Sources with direct knowledge of the operation have spoken in terms that do not suggest an investigation running out of leads. The trip was described as well worth it. The evidence secured was described as potentially devastating for Brian Hooker. The Royal Bahamas Police Force formally handed over an evidence package to the U.S. Coast Guard before the cutter departed. Sources describe it as substantial. The specific contents have not been disclosed, which is appropriate when materials are being prepared for possible prosecution. There is one more detail. A secondary torpedo-style outboard engine, documented as associated with this dinghy, is missing. It was not on the dinghy when the Coast Guard seized it. It was not on the Soulmate during the vessel examination. Its location is unknown. Experienced live-aboard sailors do not discard backup engines. They are lifelines. When the only motor on your only tender dies in open water, you are stranded. Brian Hooker is an experienced sailor. He maintained this equipment for years. The torpedo-style outboard is missing. It is an open investigative question in an active murder investigation. Open investigative questions in active murder cases tend to eventually receive answers. Carly Aylesworth spoke to ABC News on the 4th of June as the dinghy was being seized. "She has to be somewhere, so all the help that we could get, it's greatly appreciated. I'm happy they were able to get Brian's location and discover new areas to look. I know they're working very hard." She said her mother has to be somewhere. Darlene Hamlet is in Michigan. She told Jordan what was happening inside that household for years. She asked a neighbor to keep watch. She wanted someone across the street who knew that when Lynette was home alone, it was because she was trying to get away. Darlene has not been in contact with Brian since this started. She provided her DNA in May. She sits with that fact every day, that she handed federal investigators the material to identify her daughter's body. She thought keeping Jordan watching was enough. It was not. The next development could come from Quantico, from a grand jury, or from the missing engine. When it does, Crime Deepcut will be here. Subscribe. Here is where the Lynette Hooker investigation stands as of June 6, 2026. A neighbor described a 25-year cycle of domestic violence to the FBI. A search ended without Lynette, but with evidence described as potentially devastating. A formal homicide classification is in place. The dinghy, the Soulmate, and a missing secondary engine are in various stages of forensic examination. A Bahamian evidence package is in U.S. hands. The FBI laboratory at Quantico is processing evidence. Brian Hooker has not been charged. He has denied wrongdoing throughout. His attorney declined to comment on the latest developments. He is in the United States. Before the neighbor interview, this was an investigation built on digital evidence, GPS, devices, forensics. After the neighbor interview, it is an investigation with a 25-year human context behind it. Jordan Plentz did not give the prosecution its case. The GPS data did that. The physical evidence did that. She gave it something else. The story that makes the evidence make sense. Federal prosecutors have won homicide convictions without a body before. It is not common. It requires a convergence of circumstantial evidence so specific and so consistent that the only reasonable conclusion available to a jury is guilt. The GPS discrepancy, the domestic history, the forensic processing of 2 vessels, a neighbor who was watching for years, a missing engine whose location nobody can explain, a formal homicide classification. Each piece on its own is a thread. Together they form something prosecutors can work with. Lynette Hooker is 55 years old, from Onstead, Michigan. Her mother lives there, her neighbor lives there. The people who knew what was happening inside her marriage lived there, and for 25 years they watched her leave and come back. Federal investigators are building a case around what happened the last time she did not come back. Jordan said it best. She was trying to get away from the domestic violence situation. She just never made it far enough. She kept trying to leave. For 25 years, federal investigators now believe she ran out of time in the Sea of Abaco on the night of the 4th of April. That is the story the evidence is building. That is the story her neighbor already knew. And for Darlene, for Carly, for everyone who is watching from across the street, this case is not finished. Crime Deepcut stays on this case.